I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who would come to the internet to confess something like this. I used to judge stories like these. I used to read them and think, how could someone do that to their family? How could they be so selfish? Now I'm one of them. I'm writing this because I don't know where else to put the truth. My friends only know pieces. My daughters know a version that makes me look less terrible. My ex-husband knows the damage, but not everything that led up to it. This is the first time I'm telling the full story from my side, without excuses, without sugarcoating. I cheated on my husband after 25 years of marriage. Not once. Not in a moment of weakness. I built an entire secret life behind his back, and it destroyed everything. My name is Amy. I'm 49 years old, recently divorced. And the loneliness I'm sitting with now is heavier than anything I felt when I was married and bored. Chris and I married young. We weren't a whirlwind romance or some dramatic love story. We were steady, practical, comfortable. He was dependable, structured, the kind of man everyone said would make a good husband and father. And he did. We built a life together brick by brick, careers, a home, routines, and eventually our 2 daughters. From the outside, we looked solid, stable, the kind of couple people assumed would grow old together without surprises. But somewhere along the way, I started feeling invisible. It wasn't something that happened overnight. It crept in slowly, so quietly that I didn't even recognize it at first. Conversations became transactional. Days blurred into schedules. Our intimacy became predictable, safe, almost scripted. Chris wasn't cruel. He wasn't abusive. He wasn't neglectful in an obvious way. And that almost made it worse, because I felt guilty for wanting more when nothing was technically wrong. I didn't feel desired. I didn't feel exciting. I felt finished. Like the most interesting parts of my life were behind me. I tried to hint at it. I really did. I'd bring up small things, wanting more spontaneity, wanting to feel closer, wanting to try things we'd never tried before. Chris would listen, nod, and then life would continue exactly the same way. Every time he brushed it off or joked it away, a little part of me shut down. I stopped asking directly. I started fantasizing instead. That's when the seed of resentment took root. Our daughters noticed before Chris did. They were both in college, exposed to a world very different from the one I grew up in. They talked openly about relationships, boundaries, freedom. One night during a visit, the conversation drifted toward marriage. I admitted, carefully, that things felt stagnant. They didn't mean harm. I truly believe that. They talked about couples reinventing themselves, about open communication, about arrangements that worked for some people. Someone mentioned that openness saved marriages when routine killed desire. I should have stopped the conversation there. I should have gone to my husband and talked honestly. Instead, I latched onto the idea like a lifeline. Not because I wanted an open marriage, not really, but because it gave me permission in my own mind to want something else. Something more. Something that wasn't attached to responsibility or history. I told myself I'd talk to Chris about it later, when I had my thoughts organized. When I was brave enough. When the timing was right. That conversation never happened. What happened instead was curiosity and a terrible, selfish decision. Late one night, alone with my thoughts and my phone, I downloaded an app I'd heard mentioned. It promised discretion. No strings. No emotional expectations. Just attention. I told myself it was harmless. That I'd just look. That it didn't mean anything. That lie lasted about 5 minutes. The messages came quickly. Compliments. Curiosity. Desire. Men asking about me, not about bills, not about schedules, not about responsibilities. They didn't know my history or my flaws. They only saw what I showed them. For the first time in years, I felt wanted. And instead of closing the app in shame, I leaned into it. I justified it in 100 quiet ways. I told myself Chris had emotionally checked out first. I told myself I deserved to feel alive. I told myself that since nothing physical had happened yet, it wasn't really betrayal. Then it became physical. I crossed a line I can't uncross, and once I did, the guilt didn't stop me. It changed me. I became someone I barely recognized, careful, secretive, calculated. I guarded my phone like it contained my soul. I created excuses without even thinking about them. At home, I started changing too. I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back, it's painfully obvious. I tried harder in ways I never had before. I brought energy into my marriage that should have been there years ago, but now it was fueled by comparison and secrecy. Chris noticed. Of course he did. I could feel his suspicion growing. The questions. The sleepless nights. The tension in the air. Every time he looked at me like he was trying to solve a puzzle, my chest tightened, not with remorse, but with fear of being exposed. When he confronted me the first time, I denied everything. I was defensive, irritated, cold. I convinced myself that if I just stood my ground, he'd doubt himself. And for a while it worked. Or at least I thought it did. But secrets rot. They don't stay contained. The night he accused me outright, something inside me hardened instead of breaking. I told him he was paranoid. I told him he was overreacting. I made him feel crazy while I carried the truth quietly in my pocket. When he told me he'd hired a private investigator, I felt real fear for the first time. Not guilt. Fear. Because deep down, I knew what he would find. And he did. I didn't confess. I didn't come clean. I waited to be confronted with proof, photos, names, timelines I could no longer deny. When Chris laid everything out in front of me, I didn't recognize myself in the evidence. The woman in those messages, those choices, felt detached from the wife and mother I used to be. But she was me. There was no escaping that. I tried to explain. I tried to justify. I told him I felt trapped. I told him I felt unheard. And while some of that was true, none of it excused what I did. The worst part wasn't losing my marriage. It was realizing how many people I dragged into my mess, including my own children. That realization didn't fully hit me yet. Not in this part of the story. At this point, I still thought I could salvage something. Control the fallout. Rewrite the narrative. I was wrong. After the confrontation, the house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a crime scene where everything familiar had turned hostile. The walls were the same, the furniture was the same, but the air was different. Heavy. Charged. Every sound felt louder. Every silence felt intentional. Chris stopped sleeping in our bedroom after that night. He said nothing dramatic about it. He just took a pillow and a blanket and moved to the guest room like it was the most natural decision in the world. That hurt more than I expected. Not because I missed intimacy, that part of us was already dead, but because it felt like the final acknowledgement that I was no longer his wife in any real sense. I told myself I deserved it. Then, 5 minutes later, I told myself he was being cruel. My emotions swung wildly between guilt and defensiveness. One moment I hated myself. The next I resented him for not fighting harder for us. That's the ugliest truth of who I became. Even after everything I'd done, I still wanted to be seen as the wounded one. Our daughters came home a few days later. Chris hadn't told me they were coming. I assumed he'd called them for support, to rally them to his side. I braced myself for judgment, for confrontation, for being painted as the villain, which, to be fair, I was. But what I didn't expect was the look on their faces. They didn't look angry. They looked terrified. They sat with me in the kitchen while Chris stayed upstairs, deliberately absent. The silence stretched until one of them finally spoke, her voice shaking. They asked if what Dad suspected was true. I could have lied. God knows I was already good at it. But something about their eyes, the disappointment mixed with confusion, broke through whatever defenses I still had. I nodded. I didn't give details. I didn't use names. I just said yes. The crying came immediately. Not yelling. Not insults. Just quiet, devastated tears. One of them asked me why. Another asked if I still loved their father. I tried to answer honestly, but honesty sounds hollow when it follows betrayal. I told them I felt lost. I told them I made terrible decisions. I told them I never meant to hurt them. What I didn't say was that their earlier conversation about open relationships had lodged itself in my mind like permission. Not because I wanted to protect them, but because saying it out loud would have sounded like blame, and deep down, I knew the choice had been mine. Still, when they later admitted they felt responsible, something twisted inside me. Part of me wanted to cling to that shared guilt. Another part knew how wrong that was. Chris eventually came downstairs. The tension between him and the girls was immediate and painful. I could see it. The disappointment, the anger, the sense of betrayal that went beyond what I'd done to him. In his eyes, I hadn't just cheated on him. I'd poisoned the family structure he thought was solid. The argument that followed wasn't explosive. It was worse. It was controlled, sharp, restrained. Chris told them he needed space, that he loved them, but couldn't process everything while they were around. When they left the house in tears, bags half-packed, I realized how wide the blast radius of my choices really was. That night, I sat alone in the living room while Chris locked himself in the guest room. I stared at my phone, at messages I hadn't answered, contacts I shouldn't have had anymore. For the first time since this started, the attention I'd chased felt disgusting instead of flattering. But even then, I wasn't brave enough to fully confront myself. Instead of sitting with the shame, I leaned into anger. I told myself Chris was rigid, judgmental, emotionally unavailable. I replayed every time he dismissed a conversation or prioritized work over connection. I built a case against him in my own head, like a lawyer arguing for my innocence. It didn't work, because no matter how many reasons I stacked up, none of them erased the images burned into his mind, proof I couldn't undo. A few days later, he told me he'd met with a lawyer. He said it calmly, almost politely. No shouting. No threats. Just a statement of fact. He was preparing for divorce. That word hit harder than I expected. I'd imagined consequences in abstract ways. Fights, tension, therapy, separation maybe. But divorce felt final. Legal. Public. Irreversible. Panic set in. I begged. Not dramatically, not on my knees, but in quieter ways that were almost worse. I apologized over and over. I told him I'd delete everything, cut everyone off, do counseling, do anything. I told him I still loved him. He listened. He didn't interrupt. And when I finished, he said something that still echoes in my head. I believe you regret getting caught. I don't believe you regret doing it. I didn't know how to argue with that. Because if I was honest, the regret had come late, after exposure, not before. That realization hollowed me out. Chris moved out shortly after. He said staying in the same house was unbearable. I told myself I understood. What I really felt was abandoned, even though I was the one who detonated everything. The house became too quiet. No footsteps. No shared meals. No tension-filled glances, just absence. Friends started finding out. Some reached out awkwardly, unsure which side they were allowed to comfort. Others disappeared entirely. The social circle I'd taken for granted fractured quickly. People love drama from a distance, but they don't want to live inside it. I noticed something else too. The attention I'd once craved dried up fast. The men who'd been so eager, so flattering, so available vanished when things stopped being light and exciting. When I wasn't the carefree woman sneaking around, but a divorced mother dealing with fallout, I became inconvenient. That realization was humiliating. Chris, meanwhile, seemed to be rebuilding in quiet ways. I heard through mutual friends that he was staying somewhere peaceful, focusing on work, trying to stabilize. That hurt in a strange way. Not because I wanted him miserable, but because it made my own unraveling feel even more pathetic. The final blow came when my daughters stopped calling as often. They didn't cut me off completely, but something had shifted. Conversations were careful, polite, guarded. I could feel them measuring their words, protecting themselves from being pulled into my chaos. One night, alone in the house that now felt like a monument to my failures, I finally let myself feel the full weight of what I'd done. Not the thrill, not the justification, just the loss. I had traded stability, trust, and family for moments that evaporated the second reality showed up. I had wanted freedom. What I got was isolation. When the divorce papers arrived, I wasn't surprised. But I still cried like something had died. Because it had. Not just the marriage. The version of myself who believed she could bend rules without breaking everything she touched. Signing those papers felt like admitting defeat, but also like acknowledging truth for the first time. By then, Chris barely looked at me. Not with hatred. With indifference. And that, more than anger, confirmed there was no path back. The day the divorce was finalized didn't feel dramatic. There were no raised voices, no tears in the courtroom, no last-minute confessions or desperate pleas. It was quiet, almost sterile, like the official stamping of something that had already died weeks earlier. Chris and I sat a few feet apart, facing forward, our lawyers doing most of the talking. When the judge asked if we understood the terms, we both said yes. When he asked if the marriage was irretrievably broken, Chris answered without hesitation. I hesitated for half a second. Then I said yes too. That pause haunted me more than anything else. Because in that fraction of a second, I realized I did understand. I just didn't like what understanding cost me. When it was over, Chris stood up, nodded briefly to his lawyer, and walked out.
He didn't look at me.
Not once. I watched his back disappear through the door, and that was it. 25 years reduced to a few signed pages and a quiet exit. I sat there longer than necessary, pretending to organize papers, because I didn't know where else to go. The fallout after the divorce was slower, but more painful. The house went on the market. The same house where we raised our daughters, celebrated birthdays, argued over paint colors, and planned futures that would never happen. Strangers walked through it with polite smiles, pointing at walls and windows, evaluating what had once been ours like it was just another listing. I moved into a smaller condo closer to the city. At first, I told myself it was freedom, a fresh start, a new chapter. The truth was simpler. I couldn't afford my old life anymore. The first few weeks alone felt almost peaceful. No tension. No judgment. No one watching my phone. I went out more. Posted photos. Smiled in ways that looked convincing enough online. But when the novelty wore off, silence took its place. Not the comfortable silence of familiarity, the hollow kind that reminds you no one is waiting for you anywhere. The men I thought would stick around in. Messages slowed. Invitations stopped. I went from feeling desired to feeling disposable in a way that stung deeper than rejection ever had before. I'd tell myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need validation, that I was independent now. Then I'd sit alone on a Friday night, scrolling through old photos of my family, and realize how badly I was lying to myself. The hardest loss wasn't Chris. It was my daughters. They didn't cut me off completely, but our relationship changed in ways I couldn't fix. They spoke to me less, shared less. I was no longer their safe place. Conversations stayed surface level, school, work, logistics. Never feelings. I could feel their loyalty split in a way that made sense, but still hurt.
Chris was steady.
Predictable. Wronged. I was the one who'd broken something fundamental. One afternoon, months later, one of them finally said it out loud. I love you, Mom, but I don't trust you the way I used to. There was no anger in her voice. Just honesty. I nodded and told her I understood. Inside, something collapsed. Because trust, once shattered, doesn't come back just because you're sorry. And that was a lesson I learned far too late. Chris, from what I heard, was doing better. Not dramatically happier, just stable. Focused. Rebuilding quietly. That knowledge hurt, but it also forced me to confront a truth I'd avoided. He hadn't been the problem I needed him to be. He wasn't perfect, but he hadn't deserved what I did to him. I spent a long time replaying my justifications, trying to pinpoint the exact moment where things went wrong. The boredom, the resentment, the fantasies, the app, the first message, the first meeting. But that exercise eventually stopped helping. Because the real problem wasn't the marriage.
It was me.
I had confused excitement with fulfillment, attention with connection, desire with worth. And instead of facing my unhappiness honestly, I chose the easier, uglier path. There were moments I wanted to reach out to Chris, to apologize again, to explain things better, to tell him how much I regretted it. But I didn't. Because real accountability means respecting the damage you've done, including someone's right to move on without you reopening the wound. So I stayed quiet. I learned to sit with consequences instead of running from them.
Some days are easier now.
I've built routines, found work that keeps me busy, learned how to be alone without constantly trying to escape myself. Other days are brutal. Anniversaries, holidays, random moments when something reminds me of the life I detonated for temporary validation. I used to think freedom meant having options. Now I know it also means living with the weight of your choices. If anyone reading this is looking for justification to cheat, hoping it will fix something broken inside them, it won't. It doesn't heal emptiness. It multiplies it. I didn't lose everything all at once. I lost it piece by piece. Trust, family, identity, until I was left staring at myself with nowhere to hide. This isn't a redemption story. There's no surprise reunion. No happy ending. Just accountability. And the knowledge that some mistakes don't get undone, they get lived with. That's my story.